And my role in this afternoon's event is to be the moderator, Michael Davis from the Andy Thomas Space Foundation. And we have a very interesting, I hope, and impressive agenda this afternoon. We're shifting our focus to the international aspects of space, and in particular space policy. And as I'm sure you're going to learn this afternoon, there are very interesting developments happening at international level which impact directly and indirectly upon most of the work that we do in the space sector. And of course the thing about space is that it is by definition an international activity, and therefore it's important to understand the international space developments. So the format that we will follow this afternoon is that I will introduce each of the four expert presenters, and each of them will give a short presentation to outline their own focus, their own interests, and perhaps to raise some questions for discussion later in the event. When I introduce them, I'll ask them to give you a short description of their own background, their own expertise, and their own careers, so that you have a better understanding of who they are. And then we'll move into a panel discussion. And one of the benefits of having parallel sessions on day 2 of the forum is that there will be more opportunity for interaction with the audience. So I'll be encouraging all of you to put up your hand and ask questions as the debate continues. So please don't feel disinhibited about contributing to the conversation. So the first expert, and it's a very great privilege to welcome Mr. Jake Tomasis, whose title is Economic Officer at the United States Embassy in Canberra. Please welcome Jake.
Hi everyone. Thank you to the Andy Thomas Foundation for inviting me to appear on this panel of actual experts. He said there were 4 experts, there are actually 3 and me. And that's not just a quip. Unlike that, they've been dedicating their lives to this. I've only been involved in space policy for about a year. I'm a member of the US Foreign Service, which is our State Department. We rotate around to different countries around the world. We cover different portfolios around the world. So we are generalists. We dive deep into whatever subject matter we're doing at the time, but we don't have the depth of experience that my fellow panelists do. But I'm here because I can talk about US policy specifically with regard to space policy. And I wanted to start out by saying, sorry, I should do my bio. So beyond that, so I'm the Science and Technology Officer at the Embassy, so I cover space, but also artificial intelligence, quantum, cyber. I cover health policy in Australia. I cover Antarctica, and a few more. So all of these issues, we sort of scan the landscape for what's going on in Australia. We report back to Washington, and we pass along messages from Washington to the Australian government. That's in some countries that's very difficult. In Australia, that's extremely easy. We have an amazing working relationship with Australia. We think alike on most issues, and so we're in agreement most of the time, and we really get to work on execution of plans rather than just getting on the same page policy-wise. Prior to this, I was in Guadalajara, Mexico, and prior to that, I was in Washington, D.C. I've got 10 years in the federal government. Before that, I was a journalist working on Wall Street, covering finance and technology, and I started my career actually as a sports writer for a newspaper in New York State, which is where I'm from. So here in Australia, there are so many issues that the U.S. Embassy handles every day, but in my time in Australia, I haven't seen anything capture leaders' attention quite like space does. Here, we get a lot of visitors from NASA and other space agencies, and they are treated like celebrities here. It's really fun to see, and I do take advantage of it. It's a lot easier for me to get meetings with leaders in Australia when I can say that, oh, by the way, the head of human spaceflight for NASA is in town. Would you like to get a coffee? The acceptance rate on those invitations is a lot higher when I can do that versus when I just call them and say, would you like to get a coffee with me? And then, we'll meet up, and they can be fangirls and fanboys for a few minutes, and then before I have to drag them back into the boring world of U.S. policy positions. So I don't think it's controversial to say that the United States is the world's leading spacefaring nation and plays an outsized role in shaping the rules of the road. We're involved in every aspect of space policy. 20 years ago, that statement wouldn't have meant much, but as more nations begin sending objects into space or become reliant on the satellites that are already in orbit, the policy issues grow increasingly complex. So I could fill 10 slides listing every aspect of US space strategy, but I'm just going to stick to a few key aspects. So the first is to lead the world in the responsible, peaceful, and sustainable use of outer space. It's in the shared interest of all nations to ensure the safety, stability, security, and long-term sustainability of space-based activities. Responsible space actors operate with openness, transparency, and predictability to maintain the benefits of space for all humanity. The United States intends to model responsible behavior with our own actions and help other nations do the same. The second on the list is to partner with like-minded nations to form a rules-based international order. The US recognizes that while the 1967 Outer Space Treaty is the foundation, the rapid expansion of the space community requires all of us to affirm the existing order and establish rules and norms for new activities that weren't contemplated by the drafters in 1967. The Artemis Accords are the signature framework of the current age. We are proud to have spearheaded that effort and look forward to incorporating ever more like-minded nations into it. The third aspect of US space strategy is to promote a robust commercial sector. America is committed to encouraging and facilitating the continued growth of a domestic commercial space sector that is globally competitive, supports our national interests, and advances US leadership. We will foster a regulatory environment that provides clarity for enabling activities such as in-orbit servicing, debris removal, space-based manufacturing, commercial human spaceflight, and the recovery and use of space resources. Finally, the US intends to advocate for our own interests within the bounds of international law. We will protect our space-based assets. We will pursue the extraction and utilization of space resources, recognizing that they may be critical for sustainable exploration, scientific discovery, and commercial operations. To carry out our space strategy, the US has put forward many, many new initiatives. And again, what's listed here is just a tiny sample of what I could talk about. We've welcomed 10 new signatories to the Artemis Accords in 2024 alone. Armenia became the 43rd country to join in June. I think that's the last one. Although, again, 10 just in the last 6 months. There could be a 44th signing on before I'm done speaking today. We welcome any and all comers. My organization, the State Department, selected an expert in civil space as one of our science envoys for 2024. Dr. Cian Proctor is the first female commercial space spaceship pilot and the only African-American woman to ever pilot a space mission. In 2021, she was the mission pilot for SpaceX Inspiration 4, the first all-civilian orbital mission. She'll be spending the next year traveling around the world, building connections with foreign researchers, promoting space science education, and raising awareness of the importance of space science to society. Next is the Embassy Science Fellows program. That's one where scientists apply to us in the State Department to live overseas in one location for a short period as part of the diplomatic mission. So in the case of Australia, they would live under a chief of mission authority in Canberra. They usually work at the embassy and will live in embassy housing, things like that. We help provide their logistics. And during that time, we handle their logistics so that they can conduct research in the country and outreach to members of the community in that country. We are making an effort to attract more space scientists, specifically to apply to that program, because it can be scientists in any field. Last year, Embassy Canberra hosted a space weather expert, Dr. Mangala Sharma, from the National Science Foundation, and she traveled to Tasmania, to Melbourne, to Sydney, met with people, had conversations about the importance of monitoring space weather to protect assets in Australia and beyond. On space traffic, the United States, working with industry and local international partners, will lead in the development and implementation of open, transparent, and credible international standards, policies, and practices that establish the foundation for global space traffic coordination. And the last one there is to share our Earth observation data to help other governments combat climate change, natural disasters, and other health hazards. As one example, NASA and the Italian Space Agency are partnering to build the Multi-Angle Imager for Aerosols, or MAIA for short, and that's a mission that will use satellite-based measurements of airborne particulate matter to improve health outcomes in Africa and South America. So, Australia was one of the earliest partners that the US had in its space missions, but that space cooperation has ticked up in recent years, ever since our Moon to Mars initiative and the creation of Australia's own space agency in 2018. So as I said, the bilateral space relationship goes back to Honeysuckle Creek and the Apollo mission in the late 1960s. Today, so that's the sort of the past up there. Moving on to the present, 2 Australian consortiums are building prototype lunar rovers for our next moon mission. You have the Canberra Deep Space Complex, which is in the picture there, still performing critical functions for NASA every single day. You may remember it even made it into the news about a year ago when it sent out the signal that reestablished communication with the Voyager 2 satellite, which is now in deep space, well beyond Pluto. It was looking for a while like that satellite could have been lost after an error cut off communication there, but thanks to Canberra Deep Space Complex, we were able to get it back. The Technology Safeguards Agreement that came into effect this week, I'm sure you've all been hearing about it at this conference, will enable US rocket companies to launch from Australian soil. And we in the State Department in Mission Australia are following that very closely. We think it has great potential, but we don't know how much of that is going to be realized. Is there a market of US launch companies waiting to move into Australia, and what could that facilitate? So if anybody has any thoughts on that, if anybody's involved in the launch business, I'd love to speak to you afterward so that we can try to make it not just an agreement on paper, but something that will actually have a tangible impact on enabling more launches for US companies and building up the space ecosystem here in Australia. Some things our countries are looking forward to in the future are the completion of the Space Framework Agreement, which will make it much faster and easier for US government agencies to carry out projects with our Australian partners. Australia has also agreed to build a new ground station to support the next generation Landsat Earth observation program that is supposed to be up and running by 2030. The details of that agreement are being hammered out now, but it is moving close to completion. And then finally, on the commercial side, we expect to see the large US primes start to integrate smaller Australian companies into their supply chains as those smaller companies increase their capabilities. So we want to see greater integration of the big US primes, the Boeings, the Lockheed Martins, et cetera, Northrop Grumman, be able to count on smaller Australian companies and help build up those companies' expertise, provide obviously jobs and workforce development here in Australia, and be able to reinforce their own supply chains for not only commercial benefit, but US national security. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back to Michael, but I'm looking forward to discussing more at our panel discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jake. Our next presenter is Rebecca Shrimpton, and she enjoys the title Director, Defence, Strategy and National Security with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And we're really thrilled to have her. She was in London, 24 hours ago or 36 hours ago, but she made it back in time, so welcome.
Thank you. Would always make it back in time for an event like this one, being a space nerd like I am. Thank you so much for having me. I'm truly delighted to be here. This is a wonderful event that really does spotlight key issues, opportunities, and importantly also risks for Australia and the international space economy and landscape. As mentioned, I'm Beck Shrimpton. We like to make our titles as cumbersome and difficult to say as possible. I'm not going to repeat that. I come from ASPI. I work in the defence space. I was in defence itself for almost 20 years. I did a little bit of time with Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I served as a senior advisor to the Minister for Foreign Affairs, the Minister for Women, for a short stint, an interesting stint through COVID, where I was her major powers advisor, which naturally incorporated elements of space. And then I went to Austrade for a little while to try something different. Not too different though, because I headed up the defence and space team there, so looking at export opportunities and investment for Australian space industry. With that all said, I'm a defence girl at heart. I'm going to take a defence lens, and I work for a national security think tank. So what you're going to hear from me today is very much that kind of perspective and that aspect on this particular topic. I'm going to talk briefly about key trends in international space collaboration for defence and security purposes, a couple of key risks that I can see in the space domain from actors that share neither our interests nor our values, the geopolitics, sometimes called the astropolitics of space, and what this new space age means for defence and for commercial space collaboration. So on trends, there's good and there's bad news here. We are seeing ever more collaboration between like-minded groups, but also a bifurcating space environment. And this reflects some of the geopolitical dynamics that are driving defence and security concerns here on Earth. Space had for a time avoided that taint of terrestrial competition, and you would hope that with the inspiring nature of exploration and human endeavour, that it could continue to do so, but I really don't think that it can. The new called space age, space 2 or 3.0, whatever you want to call it, does have some really new and some important differences to the first space age. That one was largely a bilateral race to the moon, most publicly, but also to build and maintain military space forces capable of supporting both cold and hot war winning advantage at land, in the air and on the sea. It's now very well understood, including by competitors that have studied the US closely, that it is its space capabilities that significantly underpin the US military's capability to deploy its forces around the world in real time or near real time, including for prompt global strike. Space is central to deterrence. It has always been and likely always will be. And it's also closely connected, particularly during the Cold War period, to nuclear command and control. It's a very sensitive domain for that reason alone, but for others as well. So that means that as long as space itself remains accessible, usable and governable, it's going to be central to our national strategies and to our defence strategies. Space and defence and security strategy has gained or even regained significant attention in recent years, both for long-standing great spacefaring nations and for emerging space actors, not all of them nations alike. Countries and regional blocs have released defence and security space strategies. Australia itself released a high-level defence space strategy in 2022 after the formation of the ADF Space Command. And I should acknowledge we have the first ADF Space Commander in the room here, retired Air Vice Marshal Kath Roberts. Hi, Kath. Yes, well done. But this was not the start of our or other collaboration in and around the defence and security space world. I'll use one specific example as an illustration that I was very closely involved with how some defence and security space cooperation began and how that's manifesting and growing today. The US started in 2014 an initiative that is known as the Combined Space Operations Initiative, or CSPO. That started fundamentally as a core group of Five Eyes nations, very trusted allies and close partners. But only last year, a US DoD release announced that France and Germany, which had for some time been collaborating in a Five Eyes Plus kind of arrangement with CSPO, had actually formally joined along with Italy, Japan and Norway. So CSPO has gone from a 5 to a 10-nation defence-dominant collaboration effort. Now, what do these guys do? They get together and they discuss opportunities to further advance both operational cooperation and information sharing for the space domain. It has a stated mission to generate and improve cooperation, coordination and interoperability, to sustain freedom of action in space, to optimise resources, enhance mission assurance and resilience, and deter conflict. And there are growing risks to the space domain by actors, as I said, that do not share our values or our interests. There's an emerging pattern of collaboration, cooperation, coordination, however we want to describe it, that is emerging between China, Russia, Iran and North Korea. This is sadly becoming more and more evident in space, just as it is on Earth. This kind of collaboration might lack the structured and organisational form and scaffolding that we are used to seeing in the West and with our allies and partners, and that usually indicates to us strong national level cooperation. And it may indeed be constrained. It may be opportunistic, an axis of convenience, if you like, rather than of long-standing intent. But nonetheless, this is a very concerning development. There are specific geopolitical competition dynamics becoming ever more evident and concerning in space, and they include this tendency towards balancing and competing blocs. Again, these are blocs that do not have the same goals, they do not share the same vision for the space domain, they do not both seek a free, safe, accessible and sustainable space domain for all. The US, Australia and other like-minded nations explicitly do seek that in their strategies. But nations, including China and Russia, seek, once again, explicitly in their defence and national security strategies, to dominate the space domain, as they feel the US has done for decades, and they wish to use that ultimate high ground for their own strategic purpose. We must be clear-eyed about that. The counter-space capabilities of this quartet of nations are formidable and are growing. But what worries the likes of US Commander of Space Operations, Chance Saltzman, for example, General Saltzman, is not just these counter-space capabilities, but the general growing space capabilities of these nations. China is setting enormously ambitious goals, and it is often achieving or exceeding them. The US strategic edge in space is eroding. It needs partners to help it maintain a safe and sustainable environment for peaceful use, including for future environmental and economic benefit for much of humanity. And these partners are no longer just nation states. The locus of innovation and of genuine capability in the space domain, including in highly sensitive areas that contribute to space domain awareness, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, launch and recovery, missile warning, detection and tracking, are increasingly being developed or even completely monopolised in the West in the commercial sector. Space is almost inherently dual use today, thanks to the democratisation of the domain brought about by key developments such as miniaturisation, modularisation, reusable launch, etc., all of which have had a dramatic effect on reducing the cost of access to space. Technologies such as AI, robotics, quantum autonomy, big data analytics and more all have a key role to play in the future space environment from a defence and security perspective, as well as an economic and a scientific perspective. Now, this has led many nations to move fast to build stronger and more resilient commercial and dual-use space industries. But dual-use and exquisite military capabilities need to find ways of meshing coherently, safely and legally to support national prosperity, to support environmental and national security objectives that are absolutely vital to maintain the way of life we have all as citizens started to take for granted and that fundamentally underpin the modern way of warfare. Which brings me finally to the concept of resilient and responsive space for national security purposes. The US Space Force has recently released its much-anticipated commercial space integration strategy. This sets something of a benchmark for considering how to implement and protect a proliferated space architecture, encompassing both international partners and commercial partners into the network of capabilities that feed into US defence planning and operations and capability. Others are also doing this, not necessarily under formal strategy, but the need to draw commercial space capabilities and services into defence and national security mix is accepted now, I think, as a necessity. The collapsing of boundaries between civil, commercial and national security space has significant implications. It reinforces those trends occurring terrestrially in terms of technology competition and race dynamics. It offers enormous opportunity for commercial actors and the progress that they themselves are driving in the space domain, but it also presents challenges. The increasingly contested and congested nature of space is consistently acknowledged by military space commanders globally, but the capacity for existing laws, rules and norms to guide the right kinds of behaviour in space is lagging behind the reality of what we are actually seeing in the space domain. This is something I know and I hope we'll get into in the panel, so I'm going to stop my remarks there. Thank you very much and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Beck. We will now hear from two of Australia's leading academic commentators on space law and space policy. The first is Professor Melissa DeZwart, and she has two titles. The first is Deputy Director and Chief Investigator in the ARC Centre of Excellence in Plants for Space. And she's also Professor of Space Law and Governance with the Andy Thomas Centre for Space Resources at the University of Adelaide. Please welcome Melissa.
Thank you, Michael. So I'm going to take you a step away from the sort of defence uses of space for a couple of minutes, or am I would put in brackets there as well. Just a little bit, you know, you've heard I've got a double-barreled title. Obviously, I'm a space lawyer. My professional career was really centred around commercialisation of technology at CSIRO. And I'm very fortunate to have the role I now have at the University of Adelaide, which looks at all aspects of humanity's return to the moon, to stay and beyond, to look at human and robotic uses of space, to look at how we're going to sustain people physically and mentally while they're there, and how we're going to make space a place where humanity can actually thrive rather than just survive. So we were asked to sort of talk about opportunities, I suppose, for international collaboration in space. So today I'm going to talk to you about the two multi-state initiatives that are looking at the return of humans and a lot more robots, because we still love robots, to the moon and beyond onto Mars, because as we know, the moon is great, but it's a staging place to go even further. So, as we already heard from Jake, there are 43 states as we speak that are members of the Artemis Accords. Let me tell you, as an academic who writes papers on the Artemis Accords all the time, this is one of the most annoying things. You have to update your footnotes at least every 2 days to add in some more member countries. Of course, it's important to note about the Accords that they are an agreement that is an agreement between agencies. So we are not talking about a treaty between states that forms international law. We are talking about a set of principles that the signatory state space agencies sign onto in terms of how they will conduct their activities as part of the Artemis project. Of course, signatory to the Artemis Accords does not automatically mean that you will be also participating in the Artemis projects themselves. But it sets a very important set of policies that are becoming increasingly influential, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, in terms of how we will guide ourselves when we are in cislunar and on the moon. So, Australia was a foundation signatory. It was one of those great events that happened in 2020 entirely on Zoom. So it was a bright spot, I think, for those of us who work in space at that time. And as we've already heard, it's continued to really attract a number of participants since then. And you can probably pick out a few countries that you may or may not be more or less surprised to see in the list there. For a long time there was a discussion, for example, about whether India would become a signatory to the Accords. You have a number of Moon Agreement countries whose agencies have also signed onto the Accords. And of course Australia was the first of these and has really placed us, I think, at the forefront of the discussion of space resource activities. But there is another player, or there is another set of players, and I think personally we need to spend a bit more time focusing on what is happening with the International Lunar Research Station. I think the commentators generally agree that this is predominantly China-led. It really grew out of China's moon ambitions. It was announced as a joint partnership between China and Russia, but due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the circumstances have somewhat changed and it has become very much a China-led process. Now, I've put here ILRS members. It's somewhat difficult to really categorise the members because not all of these named states are participating in the same way in the project. Some are participating through universities, agencies, some kind of consortia. So it has a different membership mechanism from the Artemis Accords. So it is much more difficult for us to get an understanding or to get specific insights into what the rules are that will govern the activities of the ILRS on the moon. And again, it's important to recognise that both of these multilateral projects are aimed for precisely the same location on the south pole of the moon. So we're talking about a lot of operations taking place in a very small location. So The Artemis Accords, as I said, were released in October 2020, and the US, through NASA, invited other states through their space agencies to participate in the Accords, which are described as establishing a common vision via a practical set of principles, guidelines, and best practices to enhance the governance of the civil exploration and use of outer space with the intention of advancing the Artemis program. Now, if you have a look at the Artemis Accords themselves, and this is part of the great thing about this project, it's very open, it's very transparent, and for that reason, of course, can be subject also to both a lot of praise, but also a lot of criticism. It's far more easy to critique a program when you actually have been told what the rules of participation in that program are. It's far less easy to critique a program when you don't know what the rules of participation are. So a lot has been written about the Artemis Accords. It contains principles that are expressed as being founded within the Outer Space Treaty, you know, solid principles such as peaceful purposes, compliance with international law, compliance with the OST. It contains a number of principles that are quite settled and obvious within international space law, but it also includes some provisions that push a little bit further beyond that. So the provisions that deal with, for example, resource use and extraction, the provisions that deal with things like interoperability, which we've been hearing about over and over again over the last couple of days, just how important it is, because remembering again, a lot of the participants in the Artemis program will be commercial operators, so interoperability is vital. And then slightly more contentious provisions dealing with, for example, the protection of places of historical interest on the moon, and of course the provision relating to safety zones. Safety zones is provided because, again, you're going to be having a lot of people, robots first, then people, then robots and people together, all working to set up things like launch sites, landing sites. If you've ever dealt with regolith in any way, you'll know just how complicated that is. There are a lot of publicly accessible documents that have been written by NASA about what the safety operations are likely to be in the process of setting up the Artemis bases. So, as I say, a lot of interest generated by the Artemis Accords in terms of how it fits with international space law. And certainly what you are starting to get is such a large number of states being involved that you are looking at developing, as these things occur in space, state practice which will tend to lead towards the creation of international law. But it is not, at the moment, international law. It's only facilitative of moving in that direction. Now, the ILRS doesn't provide, and certainly not in English, but not even in other sources, a lot of discussion about what the actual rules will be. Partly because this is still very much, I suppose, in the startup mode, partly because of the fact that it is very much framed in what we would call the China sort of space dream. The dream that China has to exceed Russian capability. It was the junior partner, it's now the senior partner, and we've heard already about the sort of geopolitical tensions. Obviously, China has not been allowed to participate in a large number of space activities, for example, the International Space Station, due to the operation of the Wolf Amendment under the funding from NASA. So, you know, again, there's been a lot of discussion, you know, would it have been better to allow China in? Are we creating the situation where we're forcing China and some other players to really go and play in their own sandpit? I think that's something we can talk a little bit about in the discussion. How much do we know about it? One of the interesting things is that in the announcement they've said the earlier you join, the more you will be able to dictate what the rules of the game are. It talks about the areas where it is looking for cooperation are strategy development and coordination related to moon exploration and use, including areas of cooperation, planning, development of the roadmap. Interesting, of course, for me, joint development of the legal documents, regulating relations, including the involvement of third parties in the framework of the ILRS, and also review of existing standards in the field of launch vehicle, spacecraft technology, and future standards that may be used during the creation of ILRS. So it is likely that we're going to see another set of principles of standards, remembering that the Artemis Accords are quite high level, so international space law, very high level, Artemis Accords, next level, then we still need a lot of filling in those gaps. I suppose I want to really reiterate that there is this other project that we're going to be living in close proximity to, and if we're thinking about principles like due regard and safety zones, we're going to have to think about who else and how many other users are going to be up there at the same time. And even though these are sort of expressed as being civil programs, it is inevitable. There's people here, there's money here, there's equipment here that they will give rise to issues of security once we are there. So I will leave it at that and look forward to hopefully a robust discussion to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Our final speaker is Professor Stephen Freeland, who many of you will know, and Stephen is very well known as a legal expert, an expert in space law and space policy, but even perhaps more relevantly, he holds a very important position with the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, and his title is Vice Chair of the Working Group on Legal Aspects of Space Resource Activities. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Stephen.
Thank you, Michael. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Michael and Peter and Darcy, for the invitation. It's a pleasure. And I should say, and we all understand, that where we are is land that our First Nations people have been living in various ways for 65,000 years. Soon it'll be 66,000 years. I think I've been saying this for a long time. And when you think of it, that's, I don't know what that is, 3,000 generations of peoples here. And there's a lot that we can learn from understanding those Indigenous perspectives. And that's going to be highly relevant. Perhaps you might take that slide off, yes? I don't have any slides. Oh, perhaps I should take the slide off. I didn't know I was the master of my own domain here. Thank you so much. There's so much that we can learn from Indigenous perspectives, and indeed, hopefully I'll bring that into what I want to talk about. So it's just been so wonderful to be able to hear Jake and Rebecca and Melissa give you really fascinating and insightful perspectives. And my perspective comes from a slightly different angle, which is one of, let us say, governance, but please don't say he's one of those boring lawyers just talking about law. Governance in the realm of international governance of space covers a wide variety of iterations. But I should say, and all of you would be aware, there is an incredibly rich body of law that is highly, highly relevant and will continue to be relevant to all of the issues that have been raised by my wonderful colleagues, ranging from the launch to the environmental aspects, to the security aspects, to the perhaps activities on celestial bodies aspects, and a whole variety of things. sometimes the discussion about space delves quite rightly on incredibly important security aspects, and we've heard some really interesting insights today. But sometimes we fail to recognise that there are a whole range of aspects relating to the governance of space that certainly touch on the security aspects, but go, in a sense, beyond what you might think of as traditional security-related things. My thesis, the thesis of this little discussion, is that we need to understand that the governance of space, and governance covers policy, it covers guidelines, it covers law, it covers behaviours, so, think of it as a very generic thing. The governance of space involves an understanding that everything is relevant to everything else. What we do over here in space has consequences over here. When we talk about security aspects of space, we need to also talk about all the other aspects that space provides for us, because they are all interactive. Part of the problem in the governance frameworks that we have at the international level is right in the early days after Sputnik 1. Okay, what year was Sputnik 1? 57. Good. Because I'm a Sputnik baby. I was born in 1957, so I love it when people know the year, right? Almost immediately after Sputnik, the international community decided we need, space is important, right? We're in the midst of the most tense parts of the Cold War. There was this incredible strategic competition between particularly the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies. And the United Nations became involved because of the legal way that we categorise space. I won't go into all of that, but most of you would understand, even though some people don't like the term global commons, but you might want to think of space as something that we all have a stake in, however you want to describe that. And when this framework was established, essentially the thought process was this. Either, given the context of the Cold War, when you talk about space, remembering that the early space development of technology was all around extending defence and missile capabilities, either something in space is either military, weapons-related, whatever, or it's something else. And so the UN system that has emerged out of that was essentially two different agencies. So we have in Geneva a UN agency with 65 member states now called the Conference of Disarmament, and part of its mandate, not fully because it's much broader than this, is to look at weapons-related issues, security, military-related issues relating to space. And then immediately after Sputnik, another agency is established, which Michael referred to, the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. The P is important, right? Peaceful uses of outer space. CD in Geneva, UNCOPUOS now, initially it was in New York, but now in Vienna. And so the thinking was a space activity, which we now need to work out a governance framework for, because this technology was coming forward very quickly. Either it's military, security, weapons related, we'll send it down to Geneva to deal with, or it's something else, we'll send it down to Vienna to deal with. And out of the Vienna process, the UNCOPUOS process, and I haven't talked about myself, I will in a moment, but I've had the privilege, for example, of being part of the Australian delegation for about 15 years at UNCOPUOS. The UNCOPUOS process, out of that, we've had the development of an incredible array of law and guidelines and norms of behaviour and rules in a whole range of formats that are highly, highly relevant to security related. But yet we had this bifurcation which even in 1957 was inaccurate And certainly now with, as Rebecca said, the incredible dual-use nature of space is incredibly, inappropriate for the way that we govern space, because an activity can at the same time be both. On the public record, you would be aware there is a satellite that is operated by Optus called Optus C1, which was designed, owned and operated by a commercial company, designed for a proportion of its payload and capacity to be utilised for civil and commercial activities, pay TV or whatever it is, and another part of it which is used by the Australian Defence Force under obviously heavy encryption, right? That's all on the public record. So that was unique at the time that Optus C1 was designed and developed, and now there are many satellites that have similar sort of notions. But even a purely commercial operation also now increasingly, part of their paying customers are the governments, the military. And, all of the debate about the use, and I only raise this as an example without making any comment on it, the discussion about the usage of the Starlink constellations in various conflagrations that we have around the world is an example of how the commercial sector, which, as we've heard, has continued to grow and grow and grow exponentially, is helping space to become even more involved in the conduct of military activities on Earth. So it's a really complicated process, and we're trying to work out how you govern when you've got these two bodies. Even worse so because the CD is log-jammed. They have great difficulty agreeing their agenda, let alone, agreeing substantive issues. And so you've got a body that is tasked with looking at incredibly important things, unable to really come to concrete solutions, whatever that might be. You've got another body where those sorts of issues are not part of the mandate and they're slowly being brought in, but quite often if a delegation at UNCOPUOS starts talking about issues, you'll often hear, not only with this accent, but you'll often hear, niet, right? This is not part of the mandate of UNCOPUOS. And you have this whole area that really isn't discussed at this multilateral level. And we have to fix this. That said, if you look at the agenda items that UNCOPUOS, the P, right, discusses, you just go and look at their agenda items. You've got space and water, space and climate change, space and the use of nuclear power sources, the use of large constellations of small satellites, space traffic management and coordination, debris mitigation and remediation measures. The list goes on. And of course now space resources. All of those issues are relevant, obviously, for the P side, but they're also relevant for all other aspects. You can't have those 4 S's that Jake talked about, stability, security, safety and sustainability. You can't have, for example, sustainability without security being part of the mixture. You can't have security without sustainability. So as we look at the whole architecture, the whole thinking about the way we govern space and the need to work out, as Jake said, rules of the road, in addition to this incredible body of law that we do have. And I think sometimes, not for Melissa and I and others, but a lot of people underestimate the value of that law. It has meant that space has worked since I was in nappies and continues to work. And we haven't had that war in space that everybody was worried about in the Cold War period. Sure, there are great challenges, but space sort of works because of that framework. But we do need more. And so as we move forward, and I'll talk a bit more later on during our discussion, if you'd like, about the work that I'm doing in trying to work out rules of the road for space resources amongst all of the member states. We have to acknowledge this is not a unipolar or a bipolar, but it's a multipolar paradigm of capacity in space. And it is unfortunate for some, but it is necessary that all of the voices play a role in the rules of the road. And I'll just end here, and then I'll briefly tell you about myself, because Michael wanted me to, with this. We just heard from Melissa about the ILRS and the Artemis Accords. We have, in a sense, two distinct groupings, if you like, and there will be others who ultimately, maybe, depending on a whole range of imponderables and variables, wishing to engage in very similar activities in close geographic proximity, in hazardous locations, you know, where one mistake means disaster and catastrophe. And the danger is, if we don't appreciate the need for a multilateral perspective on this, the danger is that you have these two groupings, and indeed others, doing that in close proximity, but working under different rules in their mind's eye. And nothing can be more dangerous for us than that, because that is the stuff of miscalculation and misunderstandings and worse. And so it's important, I think, to understand, of course, there are geopolitical tensions. I mean, I've just come from UNCOPUOS. It is bloody hard, right, to get consensus, because every decision is a consensus base. And yet we do it 90% of the time, not all the time. And we do it because you try to find the common interests that we have, and I'll delve on that in the panel discussion, what I think the common interests are. But it's imperative on the big issues of space, and space resources is one of them, but there are many other big issues of space, that we understand that notwithstanding competition, notwithstanding geopolitical tensions, notwithstanding disagreement, we are far, far better off trying to fashion a common set of rules of the road than we are in trying to transport the unresolvable differences that we have seemingly on Earth into space. You know, I don't want to be bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. I realise this is hard, and for some this is difficult. But, you know, just go back to that example of Michael and I digging next to each other, but operating under completely different rules. You know, that, you know, is something that we must avoid. I'll stop there, and I really look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. That was a wonderful introduction to what I hope will be a stimulating panel discussion. So I'd invite our four experts, including you, Jake, to sit up on one of the high chairs. And we have two mics. Could you take them over there? I have a number of prepared questions, but I think I'm going to take the liberty of adapting the prepared questions to sort of follow on some of the issues that you all raised in order to avoid repeating the same ideas. And also, again, I encourage anyone in the audience to just put up your hand if you would like to ask a question of the panel or even make a comment. And we do have a number of experts in the audience, including our fellow director, Ms. Kath Roberts, who would have a fantastic perspective on some of these issues that we're going to talk about. But Jake, to start with you, having heard the discussion today, you're interested in encouraging like-minded spacefaring countries to take new initiatives to ensure that space remains accessible, stable and peaceful in spite of competing national interests. How well do you think the United States has done in that regard?
Obviously, spectacularly, as a representative of the U.S. government. Couldn't be better, 10 out of 10. No, I think these issues are tricky, and there is disagreement, but there are broad principles that we can agree on, and Stephen alluded to this, the common ground, and I think that the United States has done a good job in reaching out to our partners to talk about those aspects where 80-90% of the world does agree on what should be done, and we need to clearly establish that to unite behind those principles. So that's what the Artemis Accords are all about, right? There are a couple of items in there which are perhaps less universally agreed on, but the interoperability, the peaceful uses of outer space, emergency assistance, right? These are things that a lot of countries can get behind, and by opening that up to the world, encouraging other countries to come on board with that and say, all right, let's establish these guidelines and go forward under this rubric before somebody else does, right? There is that minority that is going to put national interests ahead of global interests. And we don't want them to get the first stab and have the smaller spacefaring nations just kind of fall in line behind that. We want principles that benefit the entire world. And so the US has been a leader on that. We've been a leader on combating direct ascent anti-satellite missile testing, right? This is, again, something, I mean, Russia does not agree with us on this. They launched missile that blew up one of their old satellites in 2022, caused a huge debris field that even the Russian cosmonauts on the International Space Station said was a bad idea. They had to make maneuvers to avoid the debris field. We shouldn't be doing this. The United States unilaterally declared that we were not going to engage in that types of behavior, and we're encouraging other countries to make those same declarations. There was a UN resolution passed, I think late that year in 2022, where 155 nations voted in favor. I think there were nine against and 9 abstentions. So again, this is 90% all agree on this, but let's make it clear that is not acceptable. It's going to hurt everybody. We need to avoid those destructive behaviors and get behind the more productive behaviors. And I do think that the US has done a good job. We are looking for our international partners to lead the way on some other initiatives. That includes Australia, and we hope to do so. We have many other programs in the pipeline that we're going to pursue. And I should just note as a last word, does anybody here know who the chair of the National Space Council for the United States is currently?
Yeah.
Correct. It's Kamala Harris, who you've probably seen in the news recently, could be our next president, right? So she has been tapped in on coordinating the interagency on how to make space work for the United States and how to establish these goals. And so if she was in the White House, you would have a president who was uniquely tuned in to these issues. Thanks.
As a lawyer, I have to ask this question of the 2 lawyers on the panel. For the countries that have signed the Artemis Accords, is there any uncertainty or ambiguity in relation to their obligations under the Outer Space Treaty and the other international treaties and the Accords, or are they both totally consistent with each other?
So they are consistent, and in fact, in the Accords themselves, they talk about the fact that states or agencies participate in the Accords to the extent that they are essentially able to do so within their own domestic laws. So obviously there's been a little bit of argy-bargy. Certainly, you know, I've had a bit of argy-bargy academically in journal, like it's really serious stuff. If you're like competing journal articles, that's when it gets really serious. Suggesting that, you know, Australia as a Moon Agreement member is in breach, like literally has been alleged, is in breach of its international treaty obligations. But when you actually look at what the accords say, and in fact, you know, the people who are involved in also further creating the details of those provisions also say this, is that the fine detail is not yet there. And if the issue is about, you know, our obligations to create an international regime for the use of space resources at the point at which it is about to become available, is that not the point that we are at right now? So I think we are absolutely in compliance with our treaty obligations.
If I could add to that, in a sense, without wishing to sound disparaging, you're comparing apples and oranges there.
Right.
In one sense, I mean, the treaty obligations, Australia is a party to all 5 of the treaties, one of very few countries that is, so we should pat ourselves on the back. These treaty obligations are really binding, truly binding, and Australia will do everything. And, you know, the DFAT and the agency, when they represent us at the many international fora and defence, they will do whatever they can to protect our rights under those treaty obligations. The Artemis Accords, as we've heard, many countries, these are, you know, they are a set of non-binding principles on a bilateral basis between agency to agency. That's not a criticism, but they are a totally different thing, If I could just expand a little bit on this one point though, Michael, if I may, it won't be long. So the work that I'm doing at UNCOPUOS, and I won't bore you with the modalities of it, but essentially UNCOPUOS, the Committee on Peaceful Use of Our Space, is 110 countries. It's growing all the time. I have the honour of co-chairing a working group. Working group is not 5 people. Working group is 110 countries. It's just the modality, the way UNCOPUOS operates. And part of our mandate, we are at the point that Melissa talked about now. Part of the mandate, we've got a 5-year mandate. We have to deliver to the General Assembly by 2027. Part of our mandate, agreed by the 110 countries, and that includes Iran and China and Russia and the United States and Australia, and agreed by all of them, is that we, the working group, will have a set of principles that set the foundation, in addition to the existing law, on what space resource activities look like. The 110 countries, all of them, have said this is what we want. Of course there'll be argy-bargy on what those principles look like. In fact, I have the honour of doing the 0 draft. That's my job for the next 6 months, to present to the 110 countries the first draft of what those principles look like. So if you've got any good ideas, please let me know. And of course there'll be argy-bargy. Of course the Artemis countries will say, with some justification, hey, 43 countries have signed up, these are great principles, we've talked it through, it makes a lot of sense. Just copy-paste this. And the ILRS, and I have had, you know, I've seen some drafts, and they've been early drafts of the it's hard to say, ILRS, yeah, principles. They don't look a lot different. You know, the early draft, it's obviously not finalised. The ILRS countries will say, well, look at our principles. And India and others will say, well, look at this. And other countries will look at this. And the Moon Agreement parties will say, but don't forget the Moon Agreement. And all of the Outer Space Treaty parties will say, well, don't forget the Outer Space Treaty. So there is an incredible box of marbles of inputs which will ultimately, you know, need to be discerned and argued over, so that in 2027 we have our principles to the General Assembly. But it, you know, who knows what can happen, but that's the way we are. So nothing is in conflict. They may not all be aligned, but they're all inputs towards an end goal that I think the international community, at least at this stage, wants. Because they don't want, I don't think, and this is part of this common interest that Jake talked about, they don't want the really separate rules. They want their rules to be the predominant one, but they don't want separate rules because, you know, do they really want to spend all that time, effort, energy, money, you know, political capital and everything to go to celestial bodies and then engage in conflict? Of course not. You know, it's hard enough doing just surviving, let alone anything else. And so I think we are at quite a prescient point, but at a point where all of these inputs, and Artemis is an incredibly important input, but it's one of many, are at the fore. Sorry for taking the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Rebecca, two questions, if I may. Do you have any insight into how difficult or easy it was to persuade the Australian government to be the first country to sign the Artemis Accords? And my second question is, having heard Stephen and Jake and also Melissa, are you any less concerned about the threats to international order that you outlined in your initial presentation?
Okay, I don't have any, particular insider track on what drove Australia to be if not one of the first to sign up for Artemis Accords. But we were in something of a nadir in our space journey as a nation at the time. We had established the space agency. We were very committed to developing a space industry. We were thinking about missions. We were very ambitious. So I would imagine that it just fit really nicely with the trajectory that the country was on.
Yes.
I'll probably leave that one there. I am heartened by the fact that we have people like Stephen and Melissa working really hard on these complex issues on our behalf and on behalf of the free world and the world, right? The world. That said, unfortunately, when you come from the world of defence, it is your job to think of the worst case scenarios, prepare for them and plan for them, watch the kinds of behaviours that give you indicators and warnings that things are not as they ought to be. And unfortunately, there are just so many red flags right now. I'm not optimistic that we can reach consensus positions. I do think that competition is becoming ever more entrenched, both on Earth and in space. There is so much to gain up there, and there are competing camps that want different things from that want to dominate. You know, the idea is to dominate, it's not to share. Sadly, that's my view, that is the intent. That's going to make it really, really hard, but it does not mean we should not try. And I think that is where even setting unilateral standards, we always as a nation in diplomatically engaging the US and every other partner that we have say, let's put some kind of standard out there even if we can't get consensus, because at least it's something that we hold ourselves to and can therefore hold others to. It's just something. It is a standard. It's out there, and if we commit to it, then at least it's something. But the risks are increasing. We talked about an ASAT, that's sort of direct ascent anti-satellite tests. Those tests are not just a test. Most of these countries by now know they can do this. These are demonstrations aimed at deterrence and or bringing people, coercing, convincing, compelling that it is not in other nations' interests to compete or to go up against some of these nations. As recently as 2021, we have a debris field that is going to impact Leo Belt for a long time. 2007, the Chinese ASAT created the biggest debris field I think ever tracked. And those items are still in space, causing problems for the peaceful use of space right now. Last year only, I think it was, we had hysterics out of the US momentarily. I think there's possibly likely to be more around the potential deployment of a nuclear weapon in space by the Russians. We're not in particularly calming or reassuring times. That said, that's the time to double down on the effort to create these rules and norms and to try and make some kind of framework that we can hold at least ourselves and others to in word, if not deed.
I'd like to ask another question about anti-satellite testing, but before I do, Are there any questions from the audience or comments? Oh, great.
Can I just add something, Michael, before
I think you were first, Eva.
Before, I just want to add something to what Beck said.
Yeah.
And which is about the Outer Space Treaty.
Yeah.
So it is international law. If Stephen didn't make that clear enough, then I just want to triply. So the Outer Space Treaty has done an amazing job in keeping peace in space for that period of time. As you said, you talked about the origins of the Outer Space Treaty in the Cold War and what it did in terms of keeping peace at that time. What I'm doing is I'm increasingly seeing people say things in a very good-natured way. It's like, oh, well, should we settle on the moon? Well, the so-called Outer Space Treaty says, there is some international law, but that's not really law. I really want to reiterate that the Outer Space Treaty is international law, and it is doing a good job. The fact that certain states are starting to either push towards or cross red lines should be a testament in and of itself that it is doing a job. So I want to encourage people not to use terms like so-called or wishy-washy or not actual law. It is actual law, and up until this point in time, it's done a great job. And in fact, you can see, even with the sort of grey zone type of niggles that are going on, how important the Outer Space Treaty remains.
Absolutely. Thank you for that expression of support for the Outer Space Treaty.
Vote one.
Vote one. But I think the comments so far have elicited a number of audience members who'd like to ask a question or make a comment. I think starting with you. Yeah.
Thank you. I guess to Melissa and Beck, it was really interesting to see membership of companies and IRS, and I could not think about also BRICS and all that stuff. So I would just like to understand from your position, what are the implications when we're looking at commercial space and commercial players entering supply chains?
Sorry, keep going.
Yeah. So commercial players entering supply chain, in the commercial market, you've got to look at what's cheap and effective, but companies doing incredibly well on cost.
Thank you.
How can companies manage that when it comes to supply chains, but also national security in terms of developing the product offering? Where are they buying from? How are they integrating that? And what is it when we look at rates and geopolitics?
I'll make my response quick because I think Melissa's probably better placed with her background to speak to this. But I think it just makes it really complicated and hard to navigate. It's already a difficult space to navigate between really close cooperation partners with established mechanisms for doing so. But when you've got sort of these different rules, some of which are very opaque, what is the intent? You can easily find yourself on the wrong side of the people that you do want to be doing business with, because you want to be commercially viable, because you're trying to find a customer or a place for what is potentially a brilliant space technology. So I think it's only compounds the complexity of the domain for commercial actors. All the more reason for governments and governance to try and help create frameworks that make it easier for commercial actors to navigate and understand where tolerances, red lines are, so they can make really good informed business decisions that help them on their journey to what they want to achieve.
I haven't got much to add to that because, it's just incredibly complex. I suppose the only thing to say would be, asking the question about, how far down the path of picking the two teams do we want to go? Is there some point at which we'll be able to say, well, actually, let's try to replicate the incredible success that we've had with the International Space Station in terms of creating international cooperation. You're going to have a lot more commercial operators in LEO. You're going to have a lot more commercial operators in cislunar and lunar space. How far will they have to go in terms of picking teams about who they're going to play with? I think, people are sort of urging caution about, going too far down that road.
Could I'm sorry, I know it wasn't directed to me, but just to add, I'm sorry, apology. Just one thing, I mean, it's interesting when you look at it, commercial actors, and I completely generalise, have quite an interesting dilemma in one sense, right? Around the world, I travel all the time to speak to all these countries. The biggest spender by far, the biggest customer by far in space is defence in most countries, if not all countries, right? So large and small, but particularly smaller companies, can only survive if they encourage their contacts with defence and get contracts with defence. Okay, those contracts provide defence with capabilities for the reasons that Beck talked about. But of course, it also raises the tension because every action has not necessarily an equal, but certainly has an opposite reaction, etc. So in one sense, from the private sector, massive generalisation, they want this. They want this ratcheting up of the tension, but they don't want space to become unsustainable. They're not going to make money if we can't go to space. They're not going to make money if in the end, nobody's going to make money, but the commercial sector will only make money to the extent that space works. And so we have to be very, from their perspective, they want stability and they want safety and they want all of the things that we all want as well. So, and as does defence, no doubt. But what I worry about is the ratcheting up of everything, may lead to reactions that are not necessarily rational, and that's the problem. So the private sector wants it, needs to make money, but they need to make money. And so they have a slight dilemma, but it's a massive generalisation. Thanks, Mike.
Another question?
Hi, similarly related to that, with the increase of dual-use technology, do you think we'll be seeing, or is it possible that we just won't be anytime soon, any sort of more legislation and governance about that, sort of more norms established about that? Because, obviously, targeting civilian infrastructure during wartime is a bad thing, and we shouldn't be doing that. But with the constant integration of defence and civilian infrastructure in space, do you think this is going to be an issue anytime soon?
I'll just briefly mention part of the issue is obviously not even just the merging in one thing, but the procurement. So there's an increasing procurement of services from civilian providers. So again, we heard this morning about the reserve capability of commercial operators in the US. So the involvement, I suppose, the short answer to your question is if you're talking really only about the engagement of civilian operators in hostilities, for example, or even if you're just talking about the potential for hostility, there has been work done on both the McGill Manual and the Woomera Manual, which look at the applicable law to times of tension right through to times of conflict. So I suppose that the short and slightly cheating answer to your question is that the Outer Space Treaty tells us that international law applies. So there is a body of law that does already apply to that. That would be my short answer.
Dual use is one of the, I defer to the military people, but dual use is one of the hardest things in law to deal with in terms of when you're trying to work out your rights in terms of targeting. You don't have to look at space for that. We've seen many, many examples of television stations, say, being destroyed with civilian casualties because those stations were also used as command and control centres. Think of, for example, the bombing by the NATO forces in Serbia. But that's just one of many examples. So dual use is really hard. The complication in space is that space is so unique, we don't really understand the consequences. So you can make your targeting decisions based on, well, this is a military target and there's a military advantage to me targeting this, and therefore, but to then make your calculation as to proportionality and the impacts of targeting is really difficult. It's really difficult on Earth, but it's really difficult in space as well. So space is not unique in the complexity on this, but it's even harder, I think. And so we just have to sort that through. That's why, you have really clever people working in the military who understand these complexities.
Could
Just,
I maybe just bring Jake into this conversation? And you may or may not have much that you want to say, but clearly the United States has capability, dual-use capability, including within the US government, and there must be a purpose for that capability. There is an important role, obviously, in peacekeeping, et cetera, in space. Are there any new developments or new thoughts about the United States' role as a peacekeeper in space?
So I'm not sure if I would qualify it as a new development, but we certainly do, as a leading developer of technology in the world, much of which is dual use, and I think increasingly so, that you're seeing there are so many, as technology gets more sophisticated, you're seeing so many different technologies have use cases in defense. And the US is very cognizant of protecting our national security by preventing the export of those technologies without careful guidance. And we are, in the space domain, we are establishing new export controls, which can be a little tricky because we recognize that the idea of building up the robust commercial sector has a somewhat inherent tension with those national security concerns, because we want to support our companies to build space technology and export that space technology and improve their businesses. At the same time, you can't just send these out anywhere. We already have very stringent controls with missile technology, right? And that goes to rockets, right? Rockets are missiles with minor modifications. And so the US has been always very, very careful. And that's where something like the Technology Safeguards Agreement comes in, that was just passed this week, where we would not allow US companies to launch civilian rockets from Australia or other countries without very particular safeguards in place to prevent that technology from falling into the wrong hands. Australia has agreed now to set those safeguards in terms of who can access this technology, what kind of security protocols there are, and now US companies will be able to do that. And we will continue to really carefully protect that technology and make sure that it doesn't fall into the wrong hands, at the same time giving access to our close partners. And that's where something like AUKUS comes in, and Australia passed the Defense Trade Controls Amendment Bill in late 2023, which it allows us with more comfort to circulate dual-use technology among the three AUKUS partners, because we have agreed on stricter controls over who can access that technology. So it really lowered the barriers between the three partners. It did add some additional barriers when sharing things like quantum or AI with foreign researchers or foreign entities, or the transfer of technology from one third country to another third country. There are new restrictions on that, and those are going to be necessary if we are all going to access the technology that's going to keep us all safe.
I don't know how the rest of you feel, but I feel as if we could continue this conversation for another couple of hours, but our time is up. But before I finish, would any of our panellists like to make a brief final comment?
Look, I just wanted to add on to the two questions that were asked, really. Where commerce goes, history tells us, so too does defence and security need to go with it for a nation. Just as in the maritime domain, to protect trade, maritime is a global commons. If we're going to think about space as a global commons, you're going to see, and you've already seen explicitly, the Space Force acknowledge a role to protect US commercial interests in space. So this is a dynamic that you're going to see. I think when you're really using, you've got multiple users in one kind of payload or on one satellite, where one, like the Optus C1 example, for it's a really good example. Is that a legitimate military target, if the ADF is involved in a conflict or not? Where the US is going with its proliferated architecture, with its hybrid architecture, with the idea of responsive and resilient space, it's not always about sort of trying to sort of hide or create that complex targeting mesh. It is actually about creating redundancy and resilience within the system, so that if military targets are legitimately hit, you've got commercial options to come in and backfill those kinds of capabilities. So there's a whole lot of complex ideas there. I just wanted to acknowledge they're really great questions. They're far from resolved. But there is a role for military forces in protecting commerce when that goes into space.
Right. Well, please join me in thanking our expert panel for their insights and expertise. Well, now I think it's time for afternoon tea, and thanks very much for coming along.